All right, guys, well, we'll get started here. So first of all, thank you guys for joining us today. I know we got a lot of actually new faces on today, which is great. We've been doing these for the last probably close to what, Daniel, 3 years now?
Yeah, 2017 we started.
Yeah, so good to see a lot of new faces here, and happy to have you guys join us today. So you guys have seen the topic that's going out. Obviously, it's pretty relevant with all the changes and things happening due to the COVID pandemic. Has forced a lot of us to go work remote. So we're going to spend some time today chatting about what that new environment looks like, really in the perspective of security, how to keep your company safe and how to take some good proactive stuff there. We've got some good, fantastic panelists that Daniel will introduce here in a little bit, but glad to have you guys here. Daniel, if you slide for me.
You bet. There you go.
All right. So you guys, so most of you guys know me. So I'm the Chief Cloud Officer with Auditmacs. Daniel is our other host. He and I, like I said, started this a few years back. Daniel is our Chief Technology Officer with the company. He's been about 25 years now in the technology field in kind of held positions. Yeah.
I feel old now, Jeff.
You are
you
old
put
now.
it that way.
Yeah, I mean,
no room to talk, pal. No room to talk.
That's right. Done everything from help desk positions to directors of IT to led engineering teams, a lot of the largest UC and communications providers as well, and has been our CTO for the last, I guess, 3 or 4 years now.
Yep. Yeah, 4 years.
Yeah, so great. So for you guys that are new to this event, we started this, like I said, a while back, and really it was a spawn of a lot of conversations we had with our clients and other CIOs, where kind of the conversation of, hey, it's really tough for us to stay educated. The pace of change is so fast. There's so many different technologies, so many different vendors and suppliers and things we can possibly do. And, it was just hard to keep pace, and kind of where they were going for information was once a year, maybe they get to go to a conference, or they've got a CIO group that they hit once a quarter, every 6 months, but it's really tough to kind of stay up with the pace of things that are going on. And the alternatives were go sit on a million of these webinars. You can go to these, lunch and learns that are kind of the rubber chicken luncheons, and you go listen to a slideshow and get kind of bored to tears. It's not very interactive. It just wasn't really effective. So we came up with this concept of building a community and kind of a forum of IT leaders to really give you guys the ability to come in and, one, connect with your peers, here in the local area, which started in North Florida, and now we've expanded kind of across the country. But spend some time, connect with your peers. No sales pitches, no, we're not going to take you through a slide whipping and do that kind of stuff. We do still give you food. Hopefully you guys got your Grubhub thing. You can pick your food of choice. But the focus is really on learning, right? So as an IT leader, what's on your roadmap for the next 6 months, 12 months, 24 months? Maybe now we're learning we don't prepare more than 3 months out based on not knowing what's going to be thrown at us. But, look at that, what's on the roadmap. Hear from thought leaders in the industry. We got a great one today, but hear about where they're coming from. These guys are experts. They're doing hundreds or thousands of deployments and have a lot of expertise they bring to the table. So get some of their feedback, but also have it be a very open and collaborative discussion, right? So Daniel will probably start, just because of the nature of the Zoom thing, we'll probably start in a kind of muted for everybody. But if you have questions, if there's things you want to talk about, learn more about, unmute yourself, ask the questions. We want this to be super collaborative. Those of you guys that have been in our in-person events, we expect the audience to talk probably 50% or more of the time. So by all means, we want you to get some stuff out of this, ask all the questions you have and things you want to learn about. And hopefully we hear some good stories and have some good takeaways you guys can use, immediately. Yeah, I can go to the next one, Daniel.
Yep.
Yep, so our sponsors. So, these are always sponsored, guys, and Alert Logic's our sponsor for today. They are a great partner of ours. If you guys don't know much about them, just a fantastic company, kind of an award-winning security platform. They've got some cutting-edge threat intelligence that they do, and just really do a good job at helping businesses stay protected and put together a great plan from a security perspective. So they're a great sponsor. They're going to allow us to do some cool things. As you guys know, one of the things we try and do around these events is not just be educational, but we also want to do some good. So starting really about a year ago, we've started doing, when we do get together, we want to give back to our community and to some other organizations. So we've contributed in almost every event we have to some worthy causes. Everybody from Canine for Warriors, we did Toys for Tots last Christmas. I think most recently we did the food bank here in Feeding, Northeast Florida. And this month we got another great cause we're happy to support. That's the City Rescue Mission. So those of you guys that are not familiar with them, they're a great organization that helps out the homeless here in North Florida. So it's a really good strategic partner for us at Auditmacs that we worked with for years. We have some of our executives actually on the board with that group as well. So we're happy to contribute to them and appreciate the guys from AlertLogic for helping us make that happen. I would also tell you, some folks have asked me before, we do try and mix up and rotate who we support here. So if you guys have causes that you're really passionate about, or organizations you guys want to support, by all means, let us know. We'd be happy to look at those and get nominations from you. We have a private LinkedIn group. So if you go on LinkedIn and search Jack CIO Workshop, you'll see a private group in there. There's not a lot of vendors and stuff in there at all. It's really just a group of IT leaders. But you can do some nominations there and let us know if there's some folks you want us to support and consider for the future, and we'll certainly take that into to account.
All right.
And then lastly, Daniel, I will turn it over to you to introduce Jack.
You bet.
We'll get started.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So we want to introduce Jack Danahy with AlertLogic. Super excited to have him as our special guest today and speaker. Jeff and I saw Jack speak a few months ago in another presentation, and just kind of blown away at his level of expertise and what he brought to the table. And so we really were excited then when he said he would come on our webinar series and talk to us about security. So you can see some of the highlights from the slide here, and we'll brag on Jack because he won't do it himself, but he's been in the industry 30 plus years, and from his early Unix days working HP all the way to really founded and started 3 separate security companies and sold those off to some big names in the space, WatchGuard and IBM, and then AlertLogic being the third of those. So just a ton of experience, and we refer to him as the godfather of MDR. So kind of a fun little title there that we assigned to him, and we'll talk more about what MDR means as we roll through things. So just super excited to have you, Jack, and excited for this next hour. Jeff mentioned earlier, we have until 1 p.m. Let's always keep things conversational, and just unmute yourself and ask a question vocally if you want to. We'll also try to monitor the chatting as well. So if you want to just type something in there, then Jeff, I'll ask if you or Heather can just kind of keep track of those, and we'll get that stuff answered for you as well. So, all right, well, let's dive in. I'm gonna show just one more slide, and then I'll actually turn that off so that we can see Jack and the others here. So just a quick overview of some of the topics we want to try to roll through today. It's all about security, but in kind of 3 separate groups. And the first is the new work from home environment that we've all been forced into. We want to talk through some of that. What are some of the new threats involved in the new scenario that we're in? And then we're going to spend a lot of our time there, and then we'll talk through some of the, what's the human element look like? And we're our own worst enemy sometimes, and potentially the weakest link in the chain. So we want to talk through some of those pieces, and then end up in talking about the shifting priorities piece. I want to touch on, some budget things that may be constrained right now, and then just a security posture and plan, what that looks like. So let's see. I'm going to stop the share, and then there you are, Jack. I'm going to spotlight your video so we can see you, and I see your MDR screen right back there. Your little
fully committed, man. Fully committed.
Yeah, framed art behind you. Awesome. So yeah, let's start with that first topic, which is some of the impact that we've seen of on security of this new work from home. Most companies really ramped a lot quicker than they'd planned on. And I saw a recent survey that said it was all about COVID-19 concerns, and the fears were, the vast majority of the fears I saw listed were security related, based on the new work from home scenario with people at their houses and things like that. So let's start there, and maybe you can talk for a couple minutes on what are some of the new threats that you're seeing. Are you seeing just an increase in the classics, or is there brand new stuff? And maybe start with that.
Sure. First off, thanks for having me along. And for the folks who are in attendance, thank you. Right, as Daniel and Jeff and I were talking about this, a couple of weeks ago, I'm really grateful for the opportunity. As you can tell, I've been doing security since the rocks were hot. I got a dozen patents and a bunch of different attempts, right, to try to solve this problem in different ways. And what I've learned over all those years is that the most important thing I can do, and that maybe I can do a little bit uniquely, is to talk to really smart people and help them to understand that this problem is tractable. So, that security is not always going to be awful, that you're not futilely trying to, shovel sand against the tide, but there's actually things you can do that are going to make a difference. So first off, I just want to say thank you all for giving me the opportunity to yak at you a little bit here and hopefully answer some questions to bring you some value. But to talk about, sort of the impact of both what we'll call it the increased emphasis on work from home, right, that came about as a result of the pandemic. There's been a lot of different things which have happened in terms of people's threat level, and we think of it as a threat risk inside their organizations. And a lot of it has to do with the increasing and sort of the sudden increasing deperimeterization of the way they're dealing with their businesses. Most organizations I talk to over the course of the last 5 years, maybe 10, have increasingly been sharing more with your partners, allowing employees to do more in remote offices, finding yourself using more hosting services or putting things up in the cloud. And so what we see is the erosion of what used to be this logical perimeterization between the outside dirty and the inside clean. And it forces people to rethink their security and their security posture, right? It's no longer inside and outside. I really have to be thinking about what's Jack supposed to be doing, where is he supposed to going with services he's supposed to be dealing with, and to the point about sort of the end users, right? How much damage can Jack cause if he screws it up entirely? And so I think that a lot of organizations, probably a lot of your organizations, were sort of already on the way to that journey, right? They're already trying to decide, how do I optimize? How do I take advantage of economies of scale inside the cloud? How do I take advantage of higher productivity by pushing more service out to either my partners or to my end users? And then boom, COVID happens, right? And one of the most difficult things that can happen in security is that when you're on a path and you have a plan and somebody pours gasoline on it and says, go really, really fast, things start to drop, right? We've always said that a lot of the issues inside security happen inside the gaps, right? They happen between maybe two things which are kind of secure. And as soon as I accelerate in a way I wasn't expecting to, then I'm going to create some more of those gaps. So specifically, as we talk about the last couple of months, we'll say that people have been doing a lot more working from home. I just want to put you in the minds of some of the organizations I talked to, right? So they were planning at some point in time for being able to better enable, think like as a desktop anywhere kind of scenario, right? They wanted their employees, no matter where they were, new employees to be able to stand up a new image. And so they were sort of on the path to maybe doing more cloud enablement. Maybe they were thinking about how can they virtualize a lot of that engagement. But they really hadn't gotten there yet, right? There have been no climactic event that said, you got to go do this thing right now. But then everybody has to work from home. So they hadn't bought everybody laptops, right? This virtualization experience was going to allow them to create an environment that was secure on systems that may not have been, but now everybody's working from home. So what do you do? Well, we've heard many stories of they're using the kid's high school laptop, right? They're rebooting a machine that's been in a closet for a long time because they use that powerful desktop system at the office. And there's this old machine they used to use back at the house that's, 4 patch levels deep, from the great year of 2018. And so one of the things that's happened inside that threat surface is the individual elements that are comprising what one would think of as those entry points on the outside. They are really not well cataloged or well understood, and they're definitely not well secured. So what does that mean, right? That it means a number of things. I mean, the obvious thing is that these machines are more likely to be vulnerable, and by vulnerable I mean that if the end user makes the same kind of mistake that would have been caught by a gateway system on the internal network, or would have been blocked by a decent patch or some form of endpoint protection on a corporate-owned asset, they don't have that level of protection against themselves anymore. So some of that baseline security that you used to expect to see because the systems were well managed in your own organization, not so much anymore. And it changes the nature of the way we think about protecting the organization, because now I have to think more about behaviors, right? I have to think more about the way that that system is interacting. And I also have to think more about how do I consider how much access that system is going to have when it does connect itself to my network? How can I balkanize really critical assets from what happens there? So I'll tell you, some of the good news is, and then I'll breathe, but I mean, some of the good news is we're not seeing a slew of new kinds of attacks, right? We've seen a lot of, relatively commoditized ransomware putting COVID-19 inside the subject header, right? We've seen relatively decent social engineering attacks that come down against people, with topic lines and links to things that look like government sites, for the checks, or it looks like the organization publishing a new policy. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about users and education later, but I want to let you know that we have not seen a real slew of new kinds of attacks. And we are looking at literally petabytes of data every single day across 5,000 customers. And if there was some new magical thing happening, we would have seen it. So we're not. But we are seeing a lot more repurposing of commoditized malware, commoditized ransomware. And so we're seeing organizations are under a lot more threat, but it's not necessarily a new threat. So it goes back to this question of how do we think about diligence and how do we think about protecting those end users who may be connected from systems and on networks that aren't as well protected as yours probably were when they were working in the shop.
Yeah, no, that's great. So increased attack surface, but not necessarily a lot of brand new stuff. That's interesting. So, and you talked some about the, and I kind of giggle when you said that. We've got, I don't know how many machines. When I check my router to see how many devices are plugged into my home network, and I think it's like 23 or something. I don't even know where all these things are, but a lot of us have machines at home that it could potentially be used for that. Can you talk a minute about like what type of endpoint protection should we have out there, and then maybe talk a little bit about like locally installed software that's going to potentially be on those machines? Is there any way to really manage that?
That's a great question, and it goes back to one of the reasons I'm happy to be here, right? It's all about information, right? I don't know how many of the folks on the line have actually taken the time to ask their employees what they're running on. Right, there's this simple exercise where you can start to categorize, and when you realize that Jack down the road, is running his NT server from 1999, right, and Jill over here, she's actually running a brand new machine that has perfect protection installed. You don't even know the difference anymore, right? And I'm not saying that every organization is going to have the luxury of saying, I'm going to FedEx a new machine to Jack because his machine is old as dirt. But if I know that the individual is running on an insecure platform, I can, number one, educate them about that so that they behave more conservatively. I may encourage them to change the way they interact with the company systems. Only use like shared IT, only access things statically. Find other ways, only browser your way in, and make sure that the browser at least is up to date. But at least by knowing this, some combination of education to that end user about the vulnerability of the platform that they're running on is really beneficial. And for the internal IT team or the internal security team, knowing that there's a variety of security levels across these assets can allow them to monitor differently, again, segment differently, so that the individuals in the organization who are now operating off of these less secure systems can actually be, you can protect the organization from them while you're still allowing them to get their job done. In terms of the endpoint, protection, if I were you, my recommendation is always first find out what they're currently doing. Right? What we don't want to have happen as an organization or as organizations is to begin to dictate, all right, everybody, all those machines you're running at home, I'd like you to change your life and do things in a specific way, right? Because number one, it's hard to get people to jump up and do that. And number two, you don't want to create the kind of turmoil that happens if there's some disconnect, some collision. We know for years that disparate things like antivirus products don't necessarily work really well together. They can clash. And you don't want to cause that hassle for folks who are already wrestling with the challenge of working from home. So you want to find out first off what they're running, and as an organization, sort of set a baseline for what you think is decent enough. Figure out who's going to be able to run the company's applications on their systems versus who's going to interact with the data from it remotely. Figure out how you can actually help them by limiting the amount of damage they can do. Help them to understand the way in which the protection that they have can be better configured. I think what you'll find as you do an assessment is some of them may not even have personal firewalls turned on, right? If they're working in a certain system. Some of them may not have updated a virus signature in a couple of years. Some of them may be running on a system that has dozens of applications that they don't use that are similarly out of date. And so a lot of this comes back to securing those endpoints. Start off by securing them with good hygiene, right? And then start thinking about ways in which you can improve the technologies they're using to protect themselves through reconfiguration. And as a last gasp, when you find people who are really pretty much unable to protect themselves, right, because they don't have any of the tech that's necessary, that's an opportunity for the IT teams to begin to interact and actually maybe do something more proactive with them. Because at that point, the end user, the employee understands that they're at risk. They understand the risk that they pose to the company. They'll be open to it. And by that point in time, you really narrow the amount of systems you're going to have to deal with. So the productivity hit that the organization is going to take is going to be much more limited to just a smaller number of users.
Yeah, well, I think that's great. And it makes me think of another question though. So I love the idea of having, pulling inventory and discovering what's out there. That's fairly straightforward in an enterprise environment where everyone's plugged into the LAN. What does that look like for people that are from home? Are there ways that we can capture that data and what's going on in those laptops if they're not at corporate office and maybe not even owned by corporate office?
Right. So number one, for me, there's two values to this first suggestion, right? So my first suggestion is you ask them, right? So you ask them, you can give them a script that can run on the types of systems that they're doing that just gathers information like MAC address, IP address, the IP address range locally, provider. I can get all that information off the system and send it up. So that is an interesting way to apply some automation to answer that question. But by asking the end user the question, they begin to feel more involved, right? More empowered as an element of your security program. And you're not just doing it transparently. Like I would tell you, if through some magical experience, you could have them come to the company website and it would automatically gather the data without telling them, I'd advise you to ask them for the data anyway, right? Because it lets them feel and understand that their behavior and their system is going to be an important component of the way the company continues to excel over the course of time. Another thing that I would do is, in this process, I'd be doing a much tighter job probably of monitoring the things like firewall access logs to understand who's actually coming into the systems, who's attempting to log into corporate assets from the outside. Do address range searching. I would be doing a little bit of GeoIP mapping, right? I'd want to find out what geographies people are coming from, because there is going to be a huge increase in external to internal traffic types. But the geographies shouldn't be that different from what you were dealing with, but on a much smaller basis prior to this event, right? So those same people who you're asking to come in remotely probably have thought about coming in in some form or fashion remotely, or their neighbors who work where you have as well. And so sometimes GeoIP can be a real good indicator that there's something anomalous that's happening to you, because there's going to be a flurry of traffic and you need some way to figure out what you should be looking at as sort of the first priority check.
Right. And we'll just pause here for a minute and make sure, just want to make sure if the audience has any questions, if they have a chance to ask. Anybody have any questions they want to throw out? All right. And you've always got the chat as well.
Since nobody had a question, let me throw one in here. This is Maurice from Steinmart. Thank you for having me on the council here today.
You're welcome.
So question for you, Jack. Obviously, you are a very experienced security expert. So what is your take on, let's say, high-level two types of designs to do threat management, whereby, let's say, one approach could be you implement all of your detection in the network layer, but with people moving remote, you're required to backhaul all the users' traffic through your corporate network, which has, of course, other unexpected side effects, but your network level detection will capture everything. Versus the other approach, whereby you go for a decentralized agent-based collection, whereby your intelligence is living in the agent based on the endpoint, which of course makes asset management very important, because you better make sure that every network connected device, whether it is in the office or remote, has that agent on it. From your perspective, in between these two main streams, obviously security says more is always better, but some businesses cannot just afford more. How would you look at that? Give me your opinion on those two viewpoints.
Sure. I'm going to start from the back, Maurice, and go forward. First, in security, more is not better. We are the worst industry in the universe for creating shelfware and alert fatigue. right? So, I'm not a massive fan of more. However, in answer to your question, I can give you a half a dozen attack types that wouldn't be caught by either of these individualized methods, right? If I'm watching network traffic and it's a BEC hack, followed closely by, a BEC hack that's causing some link through a secure channel network, not helpful, right? Because I'm secured point to point. And in fact, it's not even that helpful unless I'm doing keystroke logging on the agent, right? So there's different methodologies. What I would start off with is, what's the outcome that you're looking for, right? And it's a discussion we have about MDR all the time. Historically, for the first bunch of my career, it was always preventative, right? Hardened systems, elliptic curve cryptography in the kernel of the operating system to prevent privileged hacks, analyze applications, eliminate vulnerabilities, prevent. And then you realize that the conversation you end up having, is anybody ever 100% secure? And nobody in the right mind ever says yes. And so then you sort of start looking the other way and you say, well, how do I make sure that I detect as quickly as possible, which is where a lot of the work we've done in MDR pops up. Because the outcome most people want is to avoid as much damage as is humanly possible, right? Sometimes I can eliminate that by eliminating the likelihood that the attack is going to succeed. And sometimes, sadly, I have to minimize it by recognizing the attack as fast as possible once it starts to succeed. So the key answer to your question is, should I take a network-based approach? You definitely need some network-based telemetry. Things that you need for that telemetry is, like I was just talking to Daniel about, right? I want to understand GeoIP. I want to understand anomalous patterns of data exfiltration, as an example. I want to be able to recognize when there is a spurt of traffic coming from multiple machines on my network and out, which can oftentimes be an indication of CNC control, right? Being taken from somebody else on a widely spread, laterally spread attack. So I need some network. I absolutely need some network. At the same time, I need somebody to gather some information from those machines, right? Because there's some attacks which are going to happen and move around without there being any other way to get to them, right? If I think about the way take WannaCry, right? It's 2 years old now, 3 years old now. But WannaCry is on through a vulnerability. It's a remote command execution. It installs a backdoor and double pulsar, and it spreads laterally, right? If I'm not watching my machines to watch how they're changing, and I watch that in this particular case, a dropper got installed, I'm never going to know that that backdoor really exists. I can watch the traffic, but encrypted traffic flows are going to be hard to do. Most people are going to be applying their network analysis external to the system, really in-depth use of internal-based network monitoring and management to do network-based anomaly detection inside the network. It typically isn't super well informed because of the dynamism of the internal network. So I want to get some of that information off the agent. And then there's other data and other telemetry I can only really get with an agent, right? I want to get log file data. I want to get system level data. I want to do some file integrity monitoring. I want to get information from specialized systems like firewalls. Those things require agents. So I don't want to say you need them both, because you need some of them both, right? And to your question about cost, yeah, and this isn't just because I'm at Alert Logic. I think that part of the reason why the costs are high is that doing this yourself is really, really hard. It really is. I built the board of advisors for the security division at IBM as part of what I did there when I was head of advanced security. And even the biggest companies in the world struggle, right, with exactly the same question, right? Because as they get bigger, the volume of data is different. As they partner more, the dynamism in terms of sources and IDs change. The cloud occurs, and what used to be the touchstones of security, things like IP address and user ID, suddenly have no meaning. They're all super evanescent. And so it's this really changing thing. And so, for me, looking at it from the outside, what I'd rather do is I'd rather just get the outcome, right? I'd rather somebody was trying to help me do that, decrease the likelihood by doing things like inform me when I'm, out of date on patches, or I misconfigured the cloud, or, something odd's happening, left of boom. And I also want to be able to watch right of boom. Hey, this attack is underway. I just watched an exploit go up. I'm watching network traffic to a range of addresses that I know are bad. I'm seeing a pattern of behavior that looks to me to be bad, which can be gathered either from the host or from the network. And typically in a good attack, it's both, right? I need to do the commingling of the information, the normalization of it, so I can actually recognize a more sophisticated attack, which has components that live in both places. So I wish, I wish I was a zealot on one side or the other, and I'd say what you really need is network. It'll do everything for you, or what you really need is that agent. And unfortunately, it doesn't. It just doesn't work that way. And organizations and vendors who tell us that, all you need is this product that does this thing. This is going to be the thing that solves it. At the same time, when you ask them, is this really all I need? They'll say, oh, there is no silver bullet. But they're telling you what you really need is this. It's the most important thing. Well, 100%, no, not so much. So, if I were you, I'd be thinking more about the outcome. Is Steinmart, are you concerned with two different levels of security, right? There's a retail operation that I care about. I want to make sure it doesn't get violated. And there's employee data over here, because we got a lot of employees. I want to make sure that doesn't get violated, because that's a different kind of mess, right? And because of the fact we're successful, there's financial information I care about. And for a moment, just stop and think, what kinds of security events am I trying to avoid in each one of those, and sort of how do I prioritize them? And that'll lend itself to it. If I'm really worried in the financial and transactive systems about the exfil of financial data, then I'm going to watch more for exfil of financial data. If I'm worried about my internal employees and the fact that they may be making mistakes and screwing things up, maybe I want to do something that's more agent-based to watch those behaviors for the earliest incursion that happens on those machines. Maybe if it is something about my brand and my brand image, I'm really concerned about the fact that somebody could DDoS me, or I'm looking for random attacks from the outside, from IP ranges I don't know. Then you watch for that there. And so we have to start thinking as sort of experienced people that security is not monolithic, right? I don't spread it like peanut butter across the organization. I have to be thoughtful about what kinds of security are most important in what places, and when necessary, deal with partners who do this for a living. And again, not a sales pitch. Part of what I think is valuable in dealing with providers who understand organizations like your own is that they can tailor. You get sort of bespoke advice that says, there's a lot of organizations like you, and they do it this way. Have you thought about this? Maybe a problem you haven't considered because they've already resolved it for somebody else. Because really what we're looking for is the expertise to apply the right kind of security in the right context, so you're not taking on too much, doing too much, taking advantage of either technology or services you won't be able to leverage that aren't necessarily going to be germane to those threats you're looking to resolve.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that is, you're spot on. We have also taken the approach of starting with data classification and work our way out from there based on the risk and the scenarios that we want to protect for. So thank you very much. No other question from my side.
Data classification, for those who aren't doing it a lot, that is a real challenge for a lot of organizations, but it is so massively helpful, especially in the insights it gives you about the way that sometimes the organic growth of data in the services that leverage it can sometimes accidentally put tentacles out, which become sources of vulnerability. So I would give you a lot of credit. A lot of organizations don't have the patience to invest in an exercise like data classification, but it's awesome, not just because it provides for better security, but it really provides insight into some mistakes which happen organically at the best organizations.
So Jack, since you're talking through some of the different approaches, potential approaches, I wonder if you could take a minute and talk through, we introduced you as the godfather of MDR, and then there's MSSPs, so managed security service providers out there as well that have been around a long time. Can you take a minute and just talk through those two acronyms and what some of the differences are in the approach of those?
Sure. Well, first off, I'm rapidly proving I can't talk about anything in a couple of minutes, but I will do my very best. So if I think about the rise of managed security service providers, right, they started off a long time ago. I built one of the first ones back in 1995 when the internet was very, very young, working for a company called BBN, who was one of the first internet providers. But MSSPs were meant to satisfy a gap in people's expertise for setting up and managing security technologies. In those days, Firewall VPN, as it grew, Firewall VPN, IDS, log files, DLP, access control, IAM, anything having to do with security, an MSSP could be a good way to apply expertise to the iron you are already relying on, right? So think of it as bringing in a team of experts to help run stuff you've already bought. Very much capability focused on gear that you already had, very much configuration management sort of focused, although they would be able to gather for you things like log information. MDR arose to solve a different problem, right? MDR arose to solve the problem I described earlier, which is everybody sort of knows that threats change a lot in the security environment, and the environments we're dealing with change a lot, whether it's move to cloud, digital transformation, just growth through M&A, it changes rapidly. Security changes rapidly. So sort of think of it as like the threat component changes pretty rapidly in terms of the environment, And we know the bad guys working really hard, right? We've seen commingling of state-sponsored research and bad guys like we've never seen before, right? There's a leveraging of these tools by all kinds of bad guys. So the bad guys are getting more complicated. The environment is getting much more sophisticated, much more dynamic. And there's the company going like, well, how do I protect myself, right? And this is really very hard. And so MDR arose to solve the outcome question, right? The outcome question is, how do I do a better job of making sure I'm not vulnerable as these new threats are coming out? And then when something gets through, because something always does, how do I make sure that it doesn't ruin me? How do I minimize the likelihood, right? So if you look at Tenet 1 behind me on the wall, Tenet 1 talks about the value of MDR, right? And that is to minimize the likelihood or the impact of a successful attack. Two things: minimize the likelihood of the impact. That's really different than an MSSP's outcome value proposition. MSSP value proposition is, I'm going to help you get more value out of the security gear you're trying to use, or I'm going to manage your security department for you, right? Of which, a lot of that responsibility is about the care and feeding of the gear. Whereas MDR is, we're going to spend most of our time watching what's happening. We're going to watch your stuff. We're going to watch the other 5,000 customer stuff. We're going to watch the wild. And we're going to figure out, what should you be worried about, and what does it look like when somebody tries to do something bad? And what does it look like when you're becoming more vulnerable? What's it look like when your cloud configuration gets a little bit too open? What's it look like when your software gets out of date on some critical service unpatched, that kind of thing? So the value proposition for MDR is minimize the likelihood or the impact of a successful attack. The value proposition of an MSSP is, let me help you manage your security, right? It's two different things. And I think when you don't think about it too hard, they seem very similar to one another. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the manifesto, right? Which was, understand what this is supposed to do, so people who are doing one don't accidentally make you think that they're doing the other, right? Because if you come to Alert Logic and say, hey, can you manage your firewalls for us? No, we cannot, right? And if you go to an MSSP and say, can you give me a 15-minute SLA that if anything bad happens on my system, you're going to call me up and let me know or fix it? No, they cannot, right? It's two different things. Not that either one is naturally so much more valuable than the other, but figure out what you need. Back to that earlier discussion, figure out what you need, whether I want to have that MDR service, which is the experts in the infrastructure and the visibility, or do I want the MSSP to help me do a better job of running my security team?
Gotcha. Yeah, thank you. I can see the difference in the two approaches. I appreciate that. One more thing on this piece, and then we'll jump into the human element, some of the education stuff. But in our conversations, you mentioned SaaS security, and some of my research showed that, of course, everyone talks about cloud first initiatives, and a lot of us are in the cloud, certainly. But one stat I read said only 83% of the enterprises out there are comfortable or think they have the effective tools that are going to protect them. Can you talk a little bit about what SaaS security is, and potentially how Alert Logic approaches that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's two different ways to parse SaaS security, right? There is, how do I secure SaaS? How do I secure cloud? How do I do that? And what are the values of doing security with a SaaS approach? And let me just, super quick. I'm sure most of the people here, because they're taking the time to listen to us and are working with you guys, they understand the idea of the shared responsibility model in the cloud, right? The idea of the cloud, and I spent a lot of time with the gang out at AWS particularly. They actually used some of our stuff as the scalability test for Lambda when they built it. So we're definitely highly involved in AWS and do great work at Azure and GCP as well. But you go out there and they're like, we work so hard to secure the cloud. And by that they mean they're going to create a bucket that is wonderfully secure, right? It doesn't rust, it doesn't leak, the handle is secure, it's not going to break, and that bucket is great. And more than that, they're going to give you better than 50 security tools to make sure that nobody's banging on the bucket, they'll be answering your questions, and you can get all the information you need. But once you get inside that bucket, right, and the top is still open, once you get inside that bucket, it's on us as customers, right? Whether it's Alert Logic as a customer or one of you guys as a customer, right? Inside that bucket, we have to start thinking about, what can my users do? What happens to my data store? How did I configure access, right? So the security that, as you mentioned, and I think I know where that stat comes from, but that's the security that we're talking about in terms of the fact that people are uncomfortable. It's because the tooling that they used to use for security doesn't work anymore, right? I mean, there's another stat that says somewhere like more than 90% of the people believe the tools they were using won't work in the cloud. And that's because 90% of the people are really smart, right? If I'm relying on IP address as an example, right? Then very transient, doesn't really matter in the cloud, right? I'm spinning up, I'm spinning down. If I'm thinking about user ID, no, it doesn't really matter. I got roles. Roles have privileges. Roles do things. Services spin up and go. And so if I'm hoping that my old methodology is going to work, ain't, right? So the reason why they're uncomfortable is because unless you take the time to truly understand what's going on inside the cloud, you're going to have a really difficult time applying your thoughtfulness around security to the new challenge about this respinning evanescent kind of environment. And it's one of the places, frankly, where we do a lot of work, right? Because people come to us because we're a very big partner of AWS. They recommend us into their customers. So when people come and say, hey, big AWS product, but I'm scared about security, they say, go talk to these guys. And it's not buy the tools from these guys. It's let us talk to you about what it means. Let us help you understand the contingencies inside this new architecture you're using. Let us watch this for you. Let us take in inputs from all these 50 tools that they're providing with low-level information and give you a conclusion, right, that says this container is misconfigured, or you're seeing an enormous amount of transactions, or whatever, and I want to change the way that it works. So that's, for me, that's a big part about how do you secure SaaS. Now, on the plus side, right, doing security as a SaaS, and again, cloud native, alert logic, security changes like this all the time, right? 300,000 plus new malware candidates every day, right? Look through virus total, right? So constantly changing threat environment. One of the things that's beautiful about SaaS is its capacity to constantly keep information, data, applications updated without the end user having to worry about it, without the organization worrying about it. It just happens underneath the cover. So when I think about an industry where the topical data, right, the input data, the consumed data changes the most frequently, security is on the top of the list. And so SaaS provides a way not only to be able to insert new capabilities, new functionality as threat changes, but allows you to insert new examples, new data that can fuel existing things like threat detection without having to re-implement, take an update, worry about it, and fall out of date the way that a lot of security tools become less useful when you do it that way.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you, Jack. Appreciate it. And just a quick pause to make sure I'm not talking over anyone that has a question from the audience. Give you guys a minute. Please speak up if you do. So let's move on. We have 15 or 20 minutes left here. Want to talk just briefly about the human element. So can you talk a little bit about what the role of education is in security for employees and beyond?
Yeah, for sure. And some of it goes back to that early discussion, Daniel, right, when we were talking about how do we get these remote workers and help them to be secure. One of the things that to me that's always pretty inspiring is when you help organizations, and through organizations, employees better understand their role and their importance in keeping the organization secure, they step up, right? They really tend to. And I don't just mean, all right, everybody's got to sit through their mandatory, 1 hour a year training so that they don't click on bad links, right? More, help them to understand that their interaction with the data is where they're bringing their value. Their interaction with the customer information on behalf of the customer, an enter-engine request on behalf of the customer or patients is really their value. Well, let them understand that they're linchpins, important to the way the organization runs and succeeds. And so, for me, what I try to describe always that first area of importance in terms of education is letting them know their role. They're not the weakest link. They're the most important link. I mean, and it sounds counterintuitive, but there's nothing more important to your security than an end user who cares about it. The instant an end user doesn't care, I don't care how much training you give them, it's over, right? So the first bit of training is you're empowered, right? You are the reason we're going to be successful, you, the end user. And now the training we're going to give you, it's not because you're stupid, right? It's not because we expect you to make mistakes because you're the weakest link, right? It's because you're the most powerful part of our protection. And so why don't we want to reinforce you first, right? And if you've got end users who are unwilling to allow themselves to be duped or breached, and maybe they're a little bit paranoid, they're empowered, right? And they feel great about it. And every time they identify something that shouldn't be done, it's great. And it's very much, by the way, herd immunity, right? When individuals are proud of the fact that they're not getting caught through regular, malicious code testing, or they actually find a spam attack, or something happens in their private life where they're talking to their friends and their friends say, yeah, I really think I'm going to get this check. You're like, no, stop, right? They feel empowered, right? And it makes them feel even more special. And so for me, user education starts with helping them to understand how important they are as enablers of security, and try to step away from the old way that says, you've got to stop being such a horrible gap because you're inexperienced in security. Now,
Yeah.
things that I like to talk to them about, are beyond don't click on things, right? Everybody knows think before you click, right? But I can actually show you some attacks that we've developed over the years where just rolling over something to see the real link, that's an attack. Global imposter is a great example of it, right? So what I like to do, I'd like to talk to them first about hygiene, right? About understanding that, make sure their systems are up to date, watching for systems that they're interacting with are secured. Watch for weirdness on systems they're connecting to see if they've potentially been breached. Look for weirdness in email messages that are coming to them from trusted third parties or from their friends. This sort of like ability to identify that something just seems wrong is super important, super important. I can tell you that it's got to be 10 years ago. One of my wife's friends had her LinkedIn account hacked, and the person spent 6 months learning all about this person. And so by the time she reached out to my wife to try to basically get her to do something, that they had data about all the conversations my wife had with this person, right? About our families, about everything else. And so there was no way you could trust it. Now, because it was my wife, she said, this just seems a little too weird. And so she drove to the person's house, right? And let
You've trained her well, right?
Right, but right. But it's unreasonable to expect that an end user is going to know enough in every occasion not to make a mistake. So number one, I like to talk to them about hygiene. I like to talk to them about things like personal firewalls, patch levels on their machines, the way they interact, things at home. Daniel, we talked about this a little bit. Are they subnetting their internal home network? Do they put their work machine on a different machine? Those kinds of recommendations and instruction can be super helpful to help them out. And then help them understand that they are powerful in terms of identifying weirdness when it happens. In the same way, see something, say something in the real world, in the physical world, same thing. You see something weird happening, one of your coworkers sends you a message that just seems a little bit off, check with them. Check with the organization, make sure everything's still okay, because they are the best firewall we have. Those humans are the best firewall we have.
Yeah, I like the idea of empowerment and kind of making your employees the hero of the story. I mean, it's the opposite of the blame game of, okay, who did it, who clicked on it, who did.
That's exactly
where
right.
you're really creating fear.
It's such a good point, right? And publicizing when someone does that is a fantastic idea that nobody does, right? There's this, security. It's like leprosy, right? So people are like, oh, something bad happened. Nobody talk about it. Never happened, right? But when somebody inside the organization detects something going on and raises a flag, let everybody know. Hey, did you know that Jane was able to recognize this thing? This is how she did it. Jane, tell me about it. Jane says, well, I knew this was odd. And then it's great. And it's like, wow, I want to be like Jane, right? And that kind of community support, right? And those exemplars, it's super important to help them know that they're empowered and you're not just treating them like they're going to be making a horrible mistake.
Yeah. No, that's great. So I want to shift gears for our last segment here, just a couple more questions, and talk about some of the priorities and budget stuff. So I guess the first question I'm thinking of here is, as people are trying to consider what their security posture is, what are the first initial steps that you would advise they take to create that security posture if they don't already have one?
Yeah, one of the things I'd recommend, it goes back to a step sort of even before what Maurice was talking about in terms of data classification. I like system inventory. I like finding ways to make sure that I understand all the assets inside IP ranges that I know, and also being able to enumerate, other IPs that I'm just not ready, that I'm not familiar with, right? Because those systems, which ordinarily would be kind of protected because they're underneath the blanket of organizational security, a lot of them are going to be exposed because of all this remote access. So number one, I'd prioritize understanding where you're at. And, I'm going to talk about more things to do. If you just do that and start trying to address the issues you're going to have in terms of network connectivity, super promiscuous services, patch latency, that's going to take you a while, right? So prioritize that and get your hygiene straight, right? You want to decrease the likelihood, right? I'm not going to say immediately increase by tons and tons and tons the amount of monitoring you're doing. First thing, figure out your estate. Then what I would do is I'd figure out, all right, here's pockets of criticality. So again, not so much the in-depth approach that's required for data classification, but just this general sense of these systems in this area are super important and not a lot of people have to touch them, as an example. If that's the case, think about network configuration, right? Think about applying some investment into either configuring them so that they're a little bit more balkanized, or so that you're actually monitoring connectivity to that section of the network in a way that's a little bit more verbose, right? So start thinking about the layout of the security in the different areas for the way in which the business, the way that the business runs. The next thing I probably prioritize is thinking about the kinds of threats that I want to most pay attention to. And this is a case where more monitoring can be important, whether it is monitoring more towards the access points where your users are trying to get in through. I would be monitoring internally the access to the systems for anything that is anomalous, people who used to work in HR who are suddenly accessing sales systems, those kinds of things. Increase your monitoring so you recognize it. And work with somebody to actually be monitoring for attacks, like especially remote command execution styles of attacks that can come from the outside. Because the nature of what's happening in this environment is that all of our networks are becoming more porous. And so the internal vulnerabilities that we have and the gaps that we have are going to become, more relevant in terms of protecting yourself against attack, because of the fact that the porous nature of the outside is going to expose them to more things.
Yeah, I really like the idea of the inventory. I mean, it's tough to secure if you don't know it exists. So
yeah,
that seems like a great first step. Can you talk for just a minute about the concept of a SIEM and who, I guess, when should we have a SIEM? What does it actually do for us? Is there ever a scenario where it's superfluous and unnecessary?
Sure. Really quick history lesson, right? So we built security products. Yay, let's secure things. And there's more things to secure, more security products. Let's create SIEMs, which are capable of aggregating all the data from these things, right? And then they said, okay, well, what's this going to do for me? Actually, it's just giving me a centralized pile of all that data. And that's sort of a quick analysis of why these things developed, right? And people try to build on top of them the capacity to do some amount of correlation, to use a SIEM to interact with, generate some automated responses, to do that kind of thing with a SIEM. And it's a challenge, right? Because the technologies that you're implementing changes, there isn't enough static, sort of status quo operation, so that correlation is super easy in a dynamic environment. So it's hard. So if what you're trying to do is aggregate information so that you have a team of 100 people who are going to go look through it later, then a SIEM can be a way in which to perform that aggregation heterogeneously across multiple different kinds of activities. There are some SIEM as a service kinds of folks, right, who can try to help you correlate that and manage it. For me, it's funny, what I typically say is, SIEM is security, information, event management, or incident event management, depending on who you talk to. And what I always tell people is that's what people want, right? And so what you have to do is you have to decide, can my organization use a tool to get the information that they need out for security, incident, event management, right? If it's true, if they can take advantage of that tool, staff it up, be able to handle the volume, et cetera, 24/7, then maybe it seems the right investment. But what you really want is, if what you really want is security, incident, and event management, then you should go buy that, right? It's one of the reasons why I like MDR, because that's what it does. By its nature, it gathers information about what's going on in terms of security, outside and inside. It integrates things like threat intel, so you make sure you're up to date with 100% visibility, so you understand what you're looking at. And so if what you're really looking for is the outcome of security, incident, and event management, or information and event management, then really what you want is somebody else to do it for you, because the cost of that implementation, the number of people it takes to run it, the ability to scale it to 24/7 across all the platforms you have touched, it is a seriously difficult thing. And unless you're super, super, super huge and really, really, really love security, really hard to do it well.
Yeah. But it almost sounds like the SIEM is kind of missing the R from MDR, I suppose. It's gathering the information, but not necessarily responding to it.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because it's missing the I that's not in MDR, right? Because intelligence is built all through the tenants inside of MDR. And what the SIEM lacks is that intelligence. It doesn't do management well, right? Because I've got to worry about always updating my connectors and keeping things moving along and adding new tech when I have it and making sure somebody's looking at it. It doesn't do detection well, because most attacks aren't simplistic enough to catch through a single telemetry vector, right? So I've got to write my own correlations, which I probably don't have people for. And you're right, it doesn't do response particularly awesomely because it is mainly a receiver as opposed to a sender. And you have to partner it up with some SOAR and figure out how all that works. And it's super hard. And if what you want is an outcome, right, then you're probably better off going to somebody who's going to give you that outcome. Just a really quick analog. People used to buy lots and lots of machines and lots of electricity and lots of T1s because they had to basically run servers and run services. And then organizations like Amazon and Microsoft and Google came up with the cloud because people didn't want any of that. They just wanted their stuff to run and be reliable and be scalable. Go, right? And so the outcome that they were looking for was delivered by these service providers. And it's my view, and I won't jump on the soapbox here because I don't have 6 hours to talk about it, but I think that the right model for security is the same. The outcome that people want is to feel protected and get the information they need to demonstrate that they're doing the right thing for their customers and their organization. What they don't really want is 1,100 different tools that they're trying to weld into one thing, which they do aggregation on and try to figure out.
Yeah. So we're getting ready to bump up against our time here. I do feel like there's one more question I want to make sure we touch on before we wrap things up. And that is with the pandemic has created a lot of budget constraints across the board, depending on the industry. Some have actually grown, but a lot have seen some downturn in revenue and things of that nature. And that can potentially put a squeeze on IT and security. So can you talk a little bit about the best way for folks to get executive buy-in when it comes to security? I mean, it's pretty tough to show an ROI on security to management. So can you talk a little bit about how to get buy-in there?
Yeah, in fact, I appreciate the question, and I'd encourage anybody who cares to. I actually had a LinkedIn post on this just probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago. There's a number of reasons why decreasing investment in security is a bad idea. Number one, as soon as you decrease your investment in security and stop doing something you were doing yesterday, right? Assuming you were spending the right amount before, you're now negligent, right? Judge Learned Hand, the calculus of negligence says, you spend enough so that you're balancing your risk with your investment in prevention. And if that's what you were doing on Monday, on Tuesday, the pandemic hits, I've decided to cut that. Guess what? That's not good. The second thing is that security doesn't happen overnight, right? And I've seen this happen for the first time in my career where there's actually security people getting furloughed, right? Security people getting laid off, budgets being decreased. The unfortunate part about that is instantaneously security goes down. Now, in 2 months or something, as the market begins to recover and the customers are back and they're saying, hey, listen, let's go back and do where we were. Now I got to grow this back up. And so this entire space underneath that curve where you're insecure is a space where you are underprotected for what you knew you were supposed to be doing in the first place. So that's really hard as well. And the third piece is just that security isn't easy to turn on and off, right? There are practices that people engage in, there's oversight that happens, and suddenly cutting it off can have much more far-reaching effects in terms of compliance, in terms of partner relationships, in terms of brand image, that it's just, considering the amount of money that we're talking about, it just doesn't make a lot of sense because of all the forward-looking jeopardy it puts the organization.
Yeah. And is that really the best way to kind of prove out ROI when it comes to security, is to show what the potential threat can be?
Yeah, it's
or would you steer away from that?
Dan, nobody asked me for the ROI for my lunch, right? I need to eat, right? And the problem is that security vendors try to pose things in terms of ROI, or they try to pose it in terms of unrealistic expenses that you're going to occur when you see it. The fact of the matter is, you have to understand how much security you need, and then you have to go get that, right? And I think what ends up happening is that people hand wave a bit over how much security is needed because vendors are trying sometimes to sell things, right? Or that security people are trying to justify larger budgets. The fact of the matter is that, the return on security investment, unless it enables you to do a different kind of partnership or different kinds of transaction because it's more secure, really, really hard to demonstrate. What isn't as hard to demonstrate is the calculus of negligence, right? If the cost of prevention is less than the cost of damage times the likelihood of the damage, then you're negligent if you're not paying it. And it's just a more straightforward business way, the same way businesses talk about every kind of expense.
Yep. Yeah. No, I like that approach. And with that, I think we're going to try to wrap things up. Jeff, did you have any other questions that you saw in the chat that we wanted to cover quickly?
No, I don't think so. We can open it real quick if anybody else has anything that's itching at them, they want to make sure they don't miss. Guess not. Otherwise, we're good. Jack, you covered all of it.
Very great.
1 hour, we got it all set. This is one of those topics, like you said, we could go for a couple of days probably. And
absolutely.
Sure.
Well, if anything else pops up, feel free to send it on over. I'm happy to answer things off the clock.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Jack, for all your insights. We appreciate And for all you guys joining us as well, we appreciate you taking the time out. I know everybody's really busy, so we appreciate it. A couple of last takeaways. We have a security report that we've got put together that we'll share with you guys. It's about a 30-some page document. It's pretty comprehensive on the marketplace and a lot of the thoughts from folks like Jack doing some interesting things out there and some food for thought for you guys to use for research. So we'll provide that for you guys after the event. And then I'd also encourage you guys to go out and look at that Jack CIO workshop group, the private group on LinkedIn. We'll send you out some invites to it if you guys aren't part of it yet. And that's a good place for if you have other questions that you didn't get a chance to ask today or want to ask any other questions of your peers. That's a great forum to be able to do that. But with that, thank you guys. I appreciate it. Thanks to Jack. Thanks to Daniel for hosting as always. And for the rest of the group to show up. You guys are a great community and we appreciate you. Everybody stay safe and take care.
Take care, everyone. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Jack.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Jack.
it.
Thanks, guys. Everybody have a great afternoon.
Hey, Jeff,
Yeah.
give me a call, man. We got to talk about stuff.
All right, good. I like that kind of reaction. Thank you.
All right, thanks,
A little
bud.
bit more dramatic
All
with that background, that Batman background though, but I like it. I'll call you. There you go. That's
Hey,
right.
There you go.
We need to talk.
Even better.
I'm Batman.
There you go.
All right, call me.
Get that Christian Bale thing rocking.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
guys. Everybody have a good day.
See you, Shane.